Almost everyone around the world has heard about cannabis. Here in the United States, in some states it's illegal, in some states it's legal. While the ongoing debate revolving around legality continues, there has been a rise in these new compounds that can get you high but are completely legal. And that's the topic of today's discussion. So first, let's talk about THC. Almost all of us have heard about THC, but what you might not know is that THC doesn't just refer to one thing. It refers to many what are called isomers. Now, for the topic of this discussion, unless said otherwise, when I say THC, I'm really referring to Delta-8 THC. When we talk about THC, that's really what we're talking about. But what is an isomer? So an isomer is a molecule that has the same formula, but the pieces are arranged differently. For example, there are 21 carbons, 32 hydrogens, and 2 oxygens. Now, these will give rise to this structure right here. But in the different arrangements, you get all sorts of different compounds. And there's over 100 cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. And it seems like year after year, more and more are being discovered. Let's do a little analogy. Let's say you have 2 rooms. And in each room, you have 2 couches, a coffee table, TV, a painting, and maybe a desk. Although you have the same pieces in each room, you can arrange those pieces in a way that makes these rooms look completely different. And this is kind of how isomers work. But another piece I want to mention is that although the compound has the same formula, these isomers do different things. Now, THC is a naturally occurring molecule, as we all know. Now, these molecules are derived from a group of molecules one molecule called isoprene. Now, isoprene has a lot of what are called derivatives. THC can be one of them, and these derivatives are found all over the world in plants and other things. Now, a derivative that we're very familiar with is what are called terpenes. Now, terpenes are what give the cannabis plant its characteristic smell and profile and things like that. They also contribute to the smell of other things like grapefruit, or oranges, or sage, or rosemary. It's a very complex, wide variety of molecules that, as I mentioned, a lot of us are familiar with, even if you didn't know the term terpene. So for the cannabis plant, these terpenes are created in these things called trichomes. We'll talk about that in a quick second, but first, let's talk about something called the phytocannabinoids. Now, what are these? These are naturally occurring cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. Well, then the question is, what is a cannabinoid? Well, these are molecules that bind with these cannabinoid receptors. We're going to do CR for short. And these things are present in trichomes, these phytocannabinoids. So let's zoom in here and look at them. So you have these really weird looking structures. These structures are these factories, and these factories produce THC, CBD, CBN, all the terpenes that bring about the complex smells and things like that. And these factories are very, very important. A lot of really interesting complex chemistry takes place in these odd-looking structures. And within these factories is very viscous resin, which holds all these unique molecules. So for a long time, it was thought that these phytocannabinoids are only present in cannabis plants. But a lot of research has shown that they're present in things like rhododendrons. They're also present in legumes and fungi, certain species of these things. But for the most part, they're heavily present in the cannabis plant. So let's move on and talk about what's called the endocannabinoid system. So what is the endocannabinoid system? Well, this is a very interesting system in our bodies that helps regulate and mediate a bunch of different things. It mediates and regulates things like emotion, pain, immune function, gastrointestinal function, and many, many more things. The main receptor here is what's called CB1. This is heavily present in the brain. Now, CB1 is very important because it's one of the most abundant receptors in the central nervous system. There is a CB2, and this has been shown to really have a lot of function with the immune system, the process of inflammation, fighting off pathogens, and all sorts of other things. The endocannabinoid system is very, very complex, and there's a lot going on. But let's talk about THC and stuff like that. So we talked about these cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. Well, we have what are called endocannabinoids. These molecules are naturally occurring neurotransmitters. So two of the really important ones, one is called AEA and the other is called 2AG. AEA really likes the CB1 receptor, 2AG really likes the CB2. Now these connect and will turn on certain functions just like THC, CBD, and other cannabinoids. Now THC and CBD will bind very well to CB1, but they bind very loosely to CB2. But CB1 is the main receptor because this is the receptor that will turn on that function that will eventually lead to the feeling of being high. Now that process is relatively complex, but I just want to show you guys that CB1 really plays a huge role in the activity of THC. It really mediates the activity of Delta-8 THC and other isomers of the THC family. Let's briefly discuss some of these cannabinoid classes. I'm only going to do a general overview. As we move through this video, I'm going to come back here and build on what we've been learning. So you got THC-A, THC-A-B, Delta-9, what we just talked about, CBG-A, THC-V, CBC. Some of these you probably never heard of. CBD-A, CBD. CBD is something that a lot of us have heard of. CBN may be something that some of us have heard of, but at least we've heard of THC and definitely CBD. CBD has really come on the scene as a very interesting compound that's found in a lot of products. As you can see, these are just some of the many cannabinoids available. And as I mentioned, we're going to build on this stuff and show how a lot of these are connected to one another and how they relate to these legal highs. Let's get into that. So first, let's talk about Delta-8. Delta-8, I think out of a lot of these is very well known. Why is it called Delta-8? So really quickly. So it's called Delta-8 because there's a double bond between carbons 8 and 9. Delta-9 has a double bond between carbons 9 and 10. So here, Delta-9, double bond. This is a double bond here between 9 and 10, and double bond between 8 and 9. The nomenclature is a little complex. I just wanted to show you why the names are a little different. Another piece I want to mention is Delta-8 is a naturally occurring cannabinoid. It's found in the plant naturally. The thing is that if you're going to consume Delta-8, it's going to be created through a process. So this makes it semi-synthetic. It's not based off of non-natural products. It's based off of a natural product, which is usually CBD, but you got to go through a process in a lab in order to create enough Delta-8 to consume. Delta-8 also has a lower affinity for CB1. We just mentioned that CB1 really mediates the activity of THC, specifically Delta-9 THC. And Delta-9 binds pretty good to CB1. Delta-8 does not bind as much, so really you're getting a less potent effect versus Delta-8 has a pretty high affinity for CB1. So you get a similar effect, but not quite the same. So you're gonna have to consume a lot more Delta-8 to get the same effects as Delta-9. So as far as consumption, you're really gonna find a lot of Delta-8 in concentrates, oils, vapes, edibles like gummies. But there's an issue with a lot of this, and this is the same for a lot of these products we're gonna talk about. A big piece is safety. You really want to make sure you're going through a very reputable distributor. I think because Delta-8 has been around long enough, you will probably find some pretty solid companies that do it right. But this is still the wild, wild west. This stuff has not been out 30, 40 years. It doesn't have nearly the amount of research that something like Delta-9 does. Because there's a lot of money to be made, you're going to have bad actors. You're going to have people that just want to get over on you and make some money. And who knows what they're going to add to their products. And if you don't do your due diligence and just buy something randomly from a random smoke shop that might not vet their products, I'm not saying all smoke shops do that. If you get it from some random place and you don't really know what you're getting, you don't know what you're putting in your body. When it comes to money and profit, a lot of these companies, well, not a lot, you're going to have some companies that will cut costs. So you might get some byproducts or impurities that you do not want in your system. In the next slide, we're going to talk about how Delta-8 is synthesized. And I'm going to show you guys some of the pitfalls a company can go down when it comes to this type of stuff. So while Delta-8 is a legitimate product, you really, really want to be careful with how you source it and where you get it from. Because it's easy for a company to fake labs or do all that stuff. And you want to make sure you are watching what you put in your body. So let's continue. So let's talk about how Delta-8 is synthesized. This process is very similar to the other compounds we're going to talk about. I cannot get into all those specifics, so I just want to give you guys an overview with Delta-8. So you start out with CBD. Many of us have heard about CBD. What you're going to do is you're going to heat it up with a strong acid. There's a lot more steps to this, but this is just a simple explanation. You can heat it up with a strong acid. You're going to get some really interesting action happening here. But regardless, as you move down and you provide more heat, you're going to create Delta-9 THC, the compound that gets you high. You're also going to create Delta-8 THC. So you see here the arrows are different lengths. All that means is that when you heat up this Delta-9 and add a strong acid, this is a symbol for heat, by the way, you're going to create Delta-8, but you're going to create a little Delta-9. So you're going to create mostly Delta-8 and some Delta-9. That's just how it is. Really, the goal here is to minimize the amount of Delta-9 so it's legal and maximize the amount of Delta-8. If this is not done well with heat and oxygen, this will readily turn into CBN. And you don't want, there's nothing wrong with CBN, but in this process, you're trying to get Delta-8, not CBN. And this stuff will oxidize into CBN, aka just turns into CBN through a certain process. So you have to be careful when you're synthesizing this product. And I say this because when these companies are making this stuff, if you're a company that's cutting corners, you're going to cut corners with the chemistry. You might cut corners with the chemist. You want someone professional because all sorts of things can go wrong here. And you don't want to make an inferior product. Another piece I wanted to mention here is you're using a very strong acid to turn this thing into Delta-8. So you got to neutralize that acid with a base of some kind. So here is another pitfall. If this company that's creating this stuff is not doing their due diligence with the chemistry and synthesis, you could end up with some acids you do not want in your body, or all sorts of other nasty byproducts because this specific source maybe wanted to cut cost and maximize profits. Again, another reason why for choosing this product and other products, you really want to do your due diligence. I know I keep mentioning it, but it's very important because this process is not this super easy synthesis that doesn't result in like a nasty byproduct. Now, chemically, Delta-8 is favored because it's just more thermodynamically stable. It's just a more stable structure than Delta-9. So in this reaction, you're going to have way more Delta-8 than Delta-9. And this process is similar for all kinds of different chemicals that are being produced that are legal. So let's get into THC-A. This is a very interesting compound that's on the market. People are selling THC-A flower and concentrates. Let's talk about that. So THC-A is a precursor to Delta-9 THC. Just like a bachelor's is a precursor, P for precursor, to a master's. Okay, so you need THC-A in order to make THC, or Delta-9 THC. Now this is present in cannabis in pretty high amounts in comparison to other cannabinoids. So we're talking about THC-A. A stands for acid. Another important piece is that THC, CBD, and others exist first as acids, and then they are Delta-9 and CBD. We're going to talk about that in a second. Now these acids, let me just spell this differently. These acids are inactive. They don't really do anything until something happens. Now THC-A is also an isomer. So you have THC-A, where you call THC-A, THC-A-B. When we say THC-A, we're really talking about THC-A. I don't want to get into the specifics here, but that's what we're talking about. So how does THC-A become Delta-9? Most of us know that heat will convert THC-A to Delta-9, and this process is called decarboxylation. So these THC-A products are legal, and you can get the plant or the flower, concentrates, and other products. What's interesting, at least now, THC-A products are legal, and if you're not in a legal state or area, Delta-9 over a certain amount is illegal. So before we talk about this point's very interesting. Let's talk about decarboxylation very briefly. So I mentioned that you need to heat up THC-A to become Delta-9 by a process called decarboxylation of THC-A. It involves heat and some other things, mostly heat. So what is decarboxylation? Well, you're removing what's called a carboxyl group. So you're removing this group that really makes it an acid. And when you remove this group, you get this little hydrogen here and some CO2 gas. When this happens, it turns into Delta-9. These are those isomers, right? They got a slightly different structure. And these really are more analogs. But regardless, you need that heat, which is why you have to light the plant on fire or provide heat or add heat to these concentrates in order to consume them. This is why you can't just eat a cannabis flower because it's not active. Although some people do consume them and claim a lot of health benefits, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So let's continue. I want to take a little detour and talk about this farm bill. So in 2018, this farm bill came out saying that cannabis is legal if the Delta-9 THC percentage is less than 0.3%. And so if that's the case, it is hemp. If it's over 0.3, then it's illegal cannabis. So I want to give you a little situation. Let's say you have strain A, and then you have strain B. Strain A has about 32% total THC. Strain B has about 32% total THC. Strain A has about 29% THC-A, and strain B has the same amount of THC-A. Strain A has 0.5% Delta-9. Strain B has 0.2% Delta-9. And then the rest is like CBD and other things like that. This is just a very basic example. So what is the difference? Well, the difference between these two plants is that one is illegal and one is legal. That small percentage makes one legal and one illegal. So then you might be asking, well, why is this important? Won't they do different things, right? Shouldn't this strain be a lot more potent than this strain? If it's hemp, this one really shouldn't be doing too much. Well, here is the interesting point. Some of you guys are aware of this. I wasn't aware of this until this past week. When we're talking about cannabis and the high you get, what we're really talking about as far as the important piece is THC-A. THC-A, as we talked about, will turn into Delta-9, with this heat. Although Delta-9 is present in the plant, it's not present in any significant amount. If Delta-9 were present in any significant amount, you wouldn't have to light it on fire. It would already be decarboxylated. It would already be active. So when we're talking about these two plants, this Delta-9 percentage doesn't really mean anything because that's not what's causing the high in the first place. This is a loophole. A lot of people are aware of this. I think it'll get closed, but it's a legal loophole. And because of this, there are people that can sell pretty much legal weed online without much consequence. But there's a caveat. The issue here is that there's a really gray area. There's a little bit of weirdness because just like with these other products, or with Delta-8 that we mentioned, you could get a farm that's growing just CBD with little to no THC, and they're just spraying it with like Delta-8 or doing all kinds of nasty stuff to it. Like I mentioned, this is still kind of the Wild West. You really have to source your stuff very, very carefully because you don't know what people are really doing to these plants. But I wanted to mention this because I think it's important to know, and it just blew my mind when I learned about it because whoever created this bill just wasn't thinking about the chemistry involved. But what do you expect with the way our lawmakers operate? So let's continue. I mentioned that we're going to come back to this slide. So let's build on this. So we know THC-A with heat will turn into Delta-9 THC. Now the form of CBD in the plant is actually CBD-A. This with heat will turn into CBD. Another really interesting thing is this thing called CBG. I didn't know what this was until I did research for this video. Some people call it the mother of cannabinoids. Well, CBG-A, it turns out that as the plant is developing in those trichomes, in those weird looking structures that look like long mushrooms, CBG-A through a variety of complex processes will convert into CBD-A through CBD-A synthase. CBG-A will also convert into THC-A through THC-A synthase. So this is another really interesting point because without CBG-A, you're not going to get these precursor molecules. And then CBG-A will turn into CBC-A. It will help convert into CBC-A, which with heat will turn into CBC. CBC is interesting because it is not psychoactive. It doesn't really bind to CB1, but what it binds to is CB2. Now, this is noteworthy because it really has some potential as far as drug discovery to help possibly fight things like inflammation and other pieces. So this is one of those molecules that's kind of being looked at to kind of see how far it can go as far as its use as a possible drug. And CBN is known as a sleep aid and a sedative. And remember, I did mention that Delta-9 with heat and oxygen, also with light, will turn into CBN. So over time, if you have some cannabis in like a jar or something like that, over time, it can convert into CBN depending on the environment that you put it in. So let's continue. So lastly, I want to mention some of these others. There's a lot more. Really, you can consider Delta-10, THC-O, THC-P, HHC. I heard about HHC. I had no idea what THC-P and THC-O are. So let's do a brief overview of these. I'm not going to get too deep because I don't want this video to be way too long. And also at the same time, there's not a whole lot of research on these things. I really don't know when they've come on the market, but it seems to be in the last handful of years. Many of the effects that people say they experience, it's just anecdotal. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of psychoactive experience is anecdotal. It's kind of hard to study because everyone's a little different. There are many that make claims and benefits. I'm an advocate for legalization, but when it comes to cannabis, I think some people can say certain things about the plant when there hasn't really been solid research to verify those claims, like it being anti-tumor, anti-cancer. You know, there are some mechanisms you're seeing in research, but a lot more needs to be done. And in general, more study should be done with all of these things. So let's start with THC-P. So THC-P is a natural cannabinoid, but it's not present in any high amount. It's very, very, very small in its concentration. It has been shown to have a pretty high affinity for CB1, which seems like it could be a lot more potent. But how potent, I think a lot more research needs to be done, but people do claim to have a stronger experience on this stuff. But it is semi-synthetic, right? Derived from these natural products, usually CBD. Then we have THC-O, really THC-O acetate. We also have Delta-8, but I can't get into all that. This is so many of them. THC-O acetate. This is natural. It's naturally occurring. But like all this stuff, it is semi-synthetic because it doesn't really exist in heavy amounts in the plant itself. Created through a variety of processes through these natural products. There have been some concerns I saw in my research that some groups are concerned that it is very similar to vitamin E acetate, which cause a lot of issues in that vape crisis, people getting popcorn lung and all sorts of stuff, nasty stuff happening to them. This is very anecdotal, some say that it is almost psychedelic. As I mentioned before, anecdotal evidence, it's all very subjective. I don't really know how true that is. These things are very, very new, so it's kind of hard to tell. Let's talk about HHC. HHC is a naturally occurring cannabinoid. Just like all these others, semi-synthetic, not really happening, not really present in a high amount in the plant. And this is a hydrogenated compound. It's removing some double bonds and stuff. Not going to get too deep into that, but there's a process that happens naturally to create HHC, but you got to replicate it in the lab. The most important thing I wanted to mention is that this is a mixture of some isomers. I talked about these isomers. Now, this is important because this kind of relates to the purity of the product. So you got 9R HHC. This has a high affinity for CB1. Then you have 9S HHC. Don't worry about why it's called RS, just know that they're different isomers. And this has a lower affinity for CB1. Well, why is that important? There's some research that I saw that said that there's a little study done, I'm going to try and find it and put it in the description, that analyzed how much isomer or mix of isomers is in these products. There's a study that showed that 15 to 70% of HHC products are 9R HHC, which means that you could be getting a good product or an inferior product. It really depends on how things are done. Another issue with buying these things is that companies can fake labs. There's a lot of stuff you can do. And just like Delta-8, safety is a huge piece here. This stuff is very new on the scene. You gotta verify. And honestly, I don't even know with some of these really new products how you really verify if it's legit. In my opinion, there needs to be more study. Time needs to move and things need to happen that allow the public to be more aware of what these products are, how they're being made, and all sorts of other things. Now, all these have various levels of potency. There's some people that say THC-O is 3 times as potent as Delta-9. As I mentioned, some of that's anecdotal. Some of it is verified by some research, but you gotta have a much broader pool of studies and different approaches to really get an understanding of what's actually going on. So let's go through the summary and review what we learned. So we first talked about THC, how there's different isomers of THC, how THC is naturally occurring, a part of a group of compounds that are present in all sorts of different things. It's a phytocannabinoid created in these trichomes, in this viscous resin that naturally emerges from the plant as it matures and ages. We then briefly reviewed the endocannabinoid system, this really interesting system that mediates pain, emotion, the immune system, and has these receptors, notably CB1, a very abundant receptor in which THC kind of connects and binds to. It mediates and regulates the effect that THC has. And along with this, we have these endocannabinoids, these cannabinoids that we produce that connect to these very same receptors in these very complex processes. Then we did a brief overview of the different cannabinoids, and we built upon these as the video went on. Then we talked about Delta-8 THC, how it's a naturally occurring cannabinoid. It's semi-synthetic because you need to create it in great amounts by using CBD in this not long chemical process, but in this chemical process. It has a lower affinity for the CB1 receptor, which makes it less potent than Delta-9. It's found in concentrates, oils, vapes, stuff like that. And then we highlighted the safety concerns. Because this is still the wild, wild west when it comes to cannabis products, and there's a lot of money to be made, there are risks of nasty byproducts and impurities. So you really got to do your research. And this applies to a lot of the compounds we've talked about. Then we went into how Delta-8 is made. And a lot of these compounds are made the same way. You're taking a compound like CBD, and you're doing a process involving acids and bases and heats to create Delta-8 and a little Delta-9. We also mentioned that depending on how the chemistry is done, you might end up with CBN or just impure products because the chemistry just wasn't done well. And this includes acids and bases, stuff you really don't want in the final product. We talked about THC-A being a precursor to Delta-9. You have to light it on fire, you have to heat it up to turn into Delta-9. And then we mentioned that a lot of these compounds, THC, CBD, exist first as acids, and then they turn into the active form. We talked about this process called decarboxylation, how when heat is added to the THC-A compound, that carboxyl group is removed, and then you have the active Delta-9 THC that gets you high. We took a left turn and talked about this farm bill with this really interesting loophole that allows people to sell legit weed legally because of the wording of the law in regards to Delta-9 THC content. And I did mention that there's still safety, there's still other questions and concerns because there's a lot of money to be made and people could be spraying this stuff with Delta-8 or doing who knows what to the product. So you really got to source well and do your research. We built on that cannabinoid classes slide and talked about how all these compounds are created from other compounds like CBG, and THC-A turns to Delta-9 and CBD-A turns to CBD, and we talked about CBN and CBC, and there's all sorts of other things. I didn't talk about THC-V, it's just too much to address. But regardless, we kind of built on this to show all those unique connections between these cannabinoids. We then closed out talking about THC-O, THC-P, and HHC. These are all naturally occurring compounds that are semi-synthetic. A lot of these are very new. They have different affinities for the CB1 receptor. They seem to produce very different effects. There are concerns regarding their purity, like HHC, and all sorts of other things. The main point here is that these need to have a lot more research. They need to have a lot more information collected on them. The safety needs to be reviewed. There's a lot of question marks when it comes to these products. So I mentioned again, you really want to make sure you're sourcing your products well. Just because someone's selling you something saying it's going to get you high doesn't mean you want to put that stuff in your body. I think a lot of people can be desperate in maybe illegal states to get legal stuff. You can't let your desperation keep you from doing the research that you should be doing if you're going to put these products in your body, especially if they're not really verified. So that's all I got. This was a little long, but I really enjoyed doing the research for this video. This was very, very fun to make. I hope that those of you who are exploring these products or trying to understand more about these products learned a little bit more. I tried my best to cover as much as I could, but as you can see, there's a lot more that I could have covered. There's a lot more that needs to be understood. A lot more research needs to be done, but I hope this was a nice overview. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.